Your soulmate wants to talk to you. What happened to them last night will leave you speechless. My beloved friend, if this message has reached you tonight, do not rush away from it. Sometimes life has a strange way of placing the right words in front of the right person at exactly the right moment. Out of thousands of videos, countless distractions, and endless noise, something made you stop here. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was coincidence. Or maybe, deep inside, a part of you has been searching for an answer that logic alone has never been able to give. Whatever brought you here, stay with me until the end, because what you are about to hear may explain emotions that have been difficult to understand. There is someone connected to your life in a way that even they are only beginning to understand. For a long time they believed silence was the safest choice. They convinced themselves that keeping their feelings hidden would protect them from disappointment, confusion, and vulnerability. Every time your name crossed their mind, they pushed it aside. Every time a memory appeared, they buried it beneath work, responsibilities, or endless distractions. They kept telling themselves that time would eventually weaken whatever they felt. But last night, something happened that made those walls begin to crack. It was not a dramatic event that the whole world would notice. It happened quietly, in the kind of silence that often reveals truths people spend months trying to avoid. As the evening came to an end, they expected the night to be ordinary. They finished the things they needed to do. They spoke with the people around them. They smiled when they were expected to smile. From the outside, everything looked completely normal. Yet inside, there was a restlessness they could not explain. It was as though their mind wanted to move forward while their heart refused to leave something unfinished behind. They tried to distract themselves. They watched videos. They scrolled through their phone. They listened to music that usually helped them relax. But no matter what they did, one thought kept returning with quiet persistence. Somehow, every path inside their mind led back to you. At first they ignored it. After all, everyone remembers people from time to time. They told themselves it was only another passing thought. But this felt different. The memory stayed longer than expected. Small details they had forgotten suddenly became vivid again. The sound of your laughter. A conversation that seemed ordinary at the time. The way you listened without interrupting. The feeling of calm that existed whenever you were around. None of those memories arrived because they were trying to remember. They appeared naturally, almost as if their own mind had decided it was finally time to stop hiding the truth. The more they tried to move on to something else, the stronger those memories became. Instead of fading, they grew clearer with every passing minute. Hours passed, but sleep refused to come easily. They lay awake longer than usual, staring into the darkness, asking themselves questions they had successfully avoided for months. Why does this person still matter so much to me? Why does thinking about them feel different from thinking about anyone else? Why have I been pretending these feelings are smaller than they really are? Those questions had no simple answers. Yet the silence of the night has a way of removing excuses. When everything else becomes quiet, people finally hear the conversations taking place inside their own hearts. That is exactly what happened. For the first time in a long while, they stopped arguing with their emotions and simply listened. As they reflected on everything, they began noticing a pattern that had quietly shaped the past several months of their life. Every meaningful decision somehow reminded them of you. Every difficult day made them wonder how different things might have felt if they had been able to share it with someone who truly understood them. Whenever something good happened, they found themselves wishing they could tell you. Whenever something painful happened, your memory returned again. They realized this had not happened with anyone else. Many people had entered and left their life, but your presence had remained somewhere in the background, steady and impossible to erase completely. There was another realization that surprised them even more. They understood that they had not been avoiding you. They had been avoiding what you made them feel. You represented honesty. You reminded them of the kind of connection that cannot be forced or manufactured. Around you, pretending became difficult. Conversations felt genuine. Silence never felt uncomfortable. They had spent so much of their life learning how to protect themselves that when something real finally appeared, their first instinct was to step back instead of moving closer. It seemed safer to remain uncertain than to risk discovering that their feelings were deeper than they had ever imagined. Sometime during the night, an unexpected memory surfaced. It was not an important event by anyone else's standards. It was a simple moment that probably seemed ordinary at the time. Yet now, looking back, they realized that was the moment everything had quietly changed. Perhaps it was the way you encouraged them without expecting anything in return. Perhaps it was the kindness in your voice when nobody else noticed they were struggling. Perhaps it was the comfort of simply being understood without having to explain every emotion. Whatever the moment was, it had left a lasting impression. They could finally see that the feeling they carried had never disappeared. It had only been hidden beneath fear and routine. As the first light of morning slowly approached, they understood something they had never admitted to themselves before. Life had continued. Days had passed. Seasons had changed. New people had come and gone. Yet one part of their heart had remained exactly where they left it. That truth was impossible to ignore any longer. They were no longer asking whether they should forget you. Instead, they found themselves wondering how much longer they could continue pretending that nothing had changed. They did not wake up with all the answers. They did not suddenly become fearless overnight. But something inside them had shifted. The silence that once protected them now felt heavier than speaking honestly. And without fully realizing it, they began imagining what might happen if they finally found the courage to reach out, not because they expected everything to be perfect, but because some questions become too important to leave unanswered forever. Morning arrived, but it did not feel like any other morning. They opened their eyes hoping the emotions from the previous night would disappear with the sunrise, believing that sleep would somehow erase everything they had been feeling. Instead, they discovered that those emotions had only become clearer. There was no confusion left about one thing anymore. You were still occupying a place inside their heart that nobody else had been able to replace. They sat quietly for several minutes without touching their phone, without turning on the television, and without rushing into their daily routine. That almost never happened. Usually they preferred staying busy because staying busy meant they never had to think too deeply about the things they could not control. But this morning was different. Their thoughts naturally returned to you before anything else. They remembered the calm they once felt whenever your presence entered their life. They remembered how conversations with you never felt forced, how even silence carried a strange comfort, and how time always seemed to pass differently whenever the two of you shared the same moment. Those memories no longer felt like random flashes from the past. They felt like unfinished chapters waiting to be completed. The more they reflected on everything, the more they realized they had spent months trying to convince themselves that distance automatically meant feelings had disappeared. Yet nothing about this morning supported that belief. If anything, the distance had only shown them how important your place in their life had quietly become. Throughout the day they tried returning to normal. They answered messages. They focused on work. They spoke with friends. They completed responsibilities exactly as they always had. From the outside, nobody noticed anything unusual. But internally, something had changed forever. Every quiet moment reminded them of the questions that had kept them awake the night before. Every pause between conversations brought your memory back again. They caught themselves smiling at small memories that they thought they had forgotten. They remembered the kindness you showed without expecting recognition. They remembered the patience you carried when life became difficult. They remembered little details that seemed insignificant at the time but now felt incredibly meaningful. It surprised them how clearly their heart had preserved those moments while their mind had been pretending to move on. That discovery left them speechless because they understood something very few people ever admit to themselves. Genuine feelings do not disappear simply because they are ignored. They wait quietly until the right moment arrives, and then they return stronger than ever. As the afternoon continued, they found themselves wondering what your life looked like now. They wondered whether you were happy. They wondered if you still smiled the same way. They wondered whether you ever thought about them or if they had become nothing more than a distant memory. Those questions stayed with them for hours because for the first time they stopped assuming they already knew the answers. Instead, they accepted the uncomfortable truth that silence had created uncertainty on both sides. They began understanding that sometimes people are separated not because love disappears but because fear becomes louder than honesty. That realization was difficult to accept because it forced them to confront every opportunity they had allowed to pass without saying what they truly felt. They replayed conversations inside their mind, wondering whether they should have spoken differently, whether they should have stayed longer, whether they should have reached out when pride convinced them to stay quiet. Every memory carried a new meaning now. Every ordinary moment suddenly seemed important because they could finally see how many chances life had quietly placed in front of them. Listen carefully because this next part matters more than anything else. At one point during the day they accidentally came across something that reminded them of you. It could have been a familiar place, a favorite song, a simple phrase someone else spoke, or even a color that instantly brought your memory back. The object itself was ordinary, but the emotion attached to it was anything but ordinary. In a single moment they felt everything they had spent so long trying to hide. They did not push the feeling away this time. Instead, they allowed themselves to experience it completely. They realized that every memory connected to you carried peace rather than regret. It was not the memory itself causing pain. It was the possibility that they had waited too long to be honest. That thought remained with them throughout the rest of the day. They kept asking themselves one question they could no longer ignore. What if this connection still has a chance? They had never allowed themselves to ask that question before because hope felt dangerous. Hope meant becoming vulnerable. Hope meant risking disappointment. Yet something inside them refused to let the question disappear. It stayed there quietly, growing stronger with every passing hour. As evening approached once again, they noticed another change inside themselves. The fear that had controlled them for so long no longer felt as powerful as it once did. It was still there, but it no longer had complete control over their decisions. For months they had believed staying silent would protect both of you from uncertainty. Now they were beginning to realize that silence had protected nothing at all. It had only delayed conversations that perhaps should have happened long ago. They imagined what they would say if they ever had the chance to speak honestly. They imagined apologizing for the distance that fear created. They imagined admitting that your absence had affected them far more deeply than they had ever shown. They imagined telling you that despite everything life had placed between you, one part of their heart had quietly remained unchanged. These thoughts did not come from fantasy. They came from honesty, the kind of honesty that only appears after someone becomes tired of pretending they no longer care. Somewhere inside, they could already feel themselves moving toward a decision. They did not know exactly when it would happen, but they knew they could not continue living exactly as they had before. Something had shifted too deeply. Their heart had crossed a line from which there was no easy return. They finally understood that real connections are not measured by how often people speak but by how impossible it becomes to forget the way someone made you feel. And that was the truth they could no longer escape. No matter how much time had passed, no matter how many distractions entered their life, no matter how many excuses they created, the feeling connected to you remained untouched. As night slowly arrived again, they looked back at everything that had happened over the previous 24 hours. It amazed them how one quiet night had revealed emotions they had successfully hidden from themselves for so long. They realized they had been waiting for certainty before taking a step forward, yet certainty rarely arrives before courage. Sometimes courage comes first, and certainty follows later. That understanding brought an unexpected sense of peace. They no longer felt the need to fight every emotion that appeared. Instead, they accepted that some people enter our lives for reasons far greater than timing alone. Some connections remain present because they teach us something about ourselves that nobody else ever could. Whether life eventually brings two people together again often begins with one simple decision: to stop hiding from the truth. And as they sat quietly beneath another evening sky, one thought stayed with them more clearly than any other. If life ever gave them another opportunity to speak with you, they did not want fear to answer in their place ever again. The second night arrived more quietly than the first, but inside their heart nothing felt quiet anymore. All day they had tried convincing themselves that the emotions from the previous night would slowly fade, yet every hour only made one truth clearer. They were no longer running from the connection they felt with you. Instead, they had begun asking themselves why they spent so much time pretending it did not exist. They found themselves noticing little things they would normally ignore. A familiar melody playing in the background. A place that unexpectedly reminded them of a conversation they once shared with you. A stranger laughing in a way that brought back a distant memory. None of these moments seemed important on their own, but together they created something impossible to dismiss. It felt as though life itself kept placing gentle reminders in front of them, not forcing them toward a decision but quietly asking them to stop ignoring what their own heart had been trying to say for so long. They realized that every meaningful memory connected to you had one thing in common. Whenever they remembered you, they never remembered feeling pressure, fear, or uncertainty. They remembered feeling understood. That single discovery changed everything because they could not remember many people who had ever made them feel that way. In a world where everyone seemed to be rushing, competing, proving themselves, and hiding behind carefully chosen words, your presence had always felt calm. You never needed to impress them. You never needed to become someone else. Somehow, simply being yourself had created a sense of peace they had spent months trying to replace without success. As evening slowly settled again, they looked back at the choices they had made since you became part of their life. They wondered how many of those decisions had been influenced by fear instead of honesty. Fear of rejection. Fear of misunderstanding. Fear of arriving too late. Fear that perhaps they had imagined the connection while you had already moved forward. Those fears had kept them silent for longer than they cared to admit. Yet something surprising happened as they sat alone with those thoughts. Instead of feeling trapped by regret, they began feeling grateful that the truth had finally reached the surface. Sometimes people spend years denying what their heart already knows. At least now they could no longer lie to themselves. That honesty brought an unfamiliar sense of relief. It did not solve every problem, but it removed the exhausting burden of pretending not to care. They noticed something else that evening. Every future they imagined suddenly included one unanswered question. What would happen if they simply reached out? They did not imagine perfect endings or fairy tales. They simply imagined one honest conversation. One chance to speak without pride standing in the way. One opportunity to say the words they had rehearsed silently in their mind countless times. They wondered how different things might become if both of you stopped assuming what the other person was thinking. Perhaps nothing would change immediately. Perhaps everything would. But for the first time, uncertainty no longer frightened them as much as permanent silence. That thought stayed with them longer than expected. As darkness covered the sky once more, they picked up their phone more than once. Your name crossed their mind again. They considered searching for an old conversation. They wondered whether they should type a message, then paused before doing anything. Not because the feeling disappeared, but because they wanted their next step to come from honesty instead of impulse. They understood that meaningful conversations deserve sincerity, not emotional panic. Even though no message was sent that night, something important had already happened. They had stopped asking themselves whether they should talk to you and had started thinking about how they wanted that conversation to begin. That change may seem small, but inside their heart it felt enormous. The distance between silence and action had become smaller than ever before. At the same time, they began recognizing something about you that they had overlooked in the past. They realized you had probably carried your own fears, your own uncertainties, your own reasons for staying quiet. For so long they had only looked at the situation through their own emotions. Now they wondered what your experience might have been. Did you ever wait for them to speak first? Did you ever question whether they cared? Did you ever decide to remain silent because you believed they had already moved on? those questions humbled them. Instead of blaming circumstances, they began understanding that two people can care deeply about each other while both believing the other person no longer feels the same. That realization filled them with compassion rather than regret. It reminded them how easily misunderstandings grow when honesty is delayed. As the night became quieter, they walked outside for a while, hoping the fresh air would settle their thoughts. The world around them seemed peaceful, yet inside they felt as though an important chapter of their life was quietly unfolding. They looked up at the sky and allowed themselves to breathe without fighting the emotions rising within them. They understood that life rarely gives clear signs about what will happen next. Instead, it gives people moments of clarity about who they have become. And this moment revealed someone who was finally ready to stop hiding behind excuses. They no longer wanted to spend months wondering what could have happened if they had simply been honest. They no longer wanted fear to decide the direction of their relationships. Whatever happened in the future, they wanted it to be built on truth instead of assumptions. As they returned home, one final thought stayed with them. If this connection had remained alive despite time, distance, changing circumstances, and countless attempts to forget it, perhaps it deserved more than silence. Perhaps it deserved courage. Perhaps the conversation they had avoided for so long was not something to fear after all. And somewhere deep inside, where words are no longer necessary and only feelings remain, they quietly accepted something they had been resisting for far too long. Missing someone is not weakness. Caring deeply is not failure. Wanting one more chance to understand someone is not something to be ashamed of. It is simply proof that certain people leave an imprint on our lives that time cannot erase. Whether tomorrow brings a message, another coincidence, or simply another quiet day, one truth has already become impossible for them to ignore. Your place inside their heart is no longer a question they are trying to answer. It has become a truth they are finally ready to accept, and with every passing day, that truth feels less like a burden and more like the beginning of the conversation they have wanted to have with you all along. The following morning carried a different kind of silence. It was no longer the silence of confusion but the silence that comes after someone finally accepts a truth they have been avoiding. They woke up feeling strangely calm, yet that calmness carried an emotional weight they had never experienced before. For the first time in months, they stopped trying to convince themselves that everything they felt would eventually disappear. Instead, they accepted that some people leave an impression so deep that no amount of time can simply erase it. As they prepared for the day, they caught themselves smiling for reasons they could not fully explain. It was not because every problem had suddenly disappeared. Their life was still filled with responsibilities, unanswered questions, and ordinary routines. But somewhere beneath all of that, hope had quietly returned. It was a cautious hope, one they were almost afraid to acknowledge, because hope has a way of making people vulnerable. Yet despite that fear, it remained. Throughout the day they noticed themselves becoming unusually aware of everything around them. Conversations that once seemed important now felt temporary. Endless distractions no longer held their attention for very long. Their thoughts repeatedly returned to one simple idea. If someone truly matters, why should fear decide the future? That question stayed with them no matter where they went. While walking through familiar streets, they imagined what they would say if life unexpectedly placed you in front of them. They did not imagine dramatic speeches or perfect words. Instead, they imagined something much simpler. They imagined looking at you honestly and saying that they had been carrying far more inside their heart than they had ever allowed themselves to express. They imagined telling you that distance had not changed the way they remembered you. They imagined admitting that some of the happiest moments they still carried were connected to memories you probably considered ordinary. That thought surprised them because they realized happiness is rarely created by extraordinary events. More often it is built from small moments that quietly stay with us forever. They remembered conversations that lasted only a few minutes but somehow remained unforgettable. They remembered shared laughter that arrived without effort. They remembered the comfort of feeling understood without needing to explain every emotion. As those memories returned, they recognized something else. None of them were built on perfection. They were built on authenticity. You never tried to become someone else around them, and perhaps that was exactly why they felt so safe whenever your paths crossed. In a world where so many interactions feel rushed or carefully rehearsed, your honesty had become something their heart continued searching for. As the afternoon slowly passed, another thought entered their mind. They wondered whether you had ever realized the impact you made simply by being yourself. Sometimes people never discover how deeply they influence another person's life because the one carrying those feelings never finds the courage to speak. They questioned whether you had any idea how often your kindness returned to their thoughts during difficult days. They wondered if you knew that your encouragement had stayed with them long after the conversation ended. They wondered whether you had ever noticed the moments they became unusually quiet around you, not because they had nothing to say but because they were trying to understand emotions that had arrived without warning. The more they reflected, the more they understood that silence can hide affection just as easily as words can reveal it. As evening approached once again, they found themselves standing in front of a window watching the world continue as usual. Cars moved through the streets. People hurried home. Children laughed in the distance. Everything around them appeared completely ordinary, yet inside they felt as though they were standing at the edge of an important decision. They understood that life rarely waits forever. Opportunities have a quiet way of passing when people continue expecting the perfect moment. They had spent too much time believing that someday courage would simply appear on its own. Now they realized courage often arrives only after someone decides that remaining silent has become more painful than speaking honestly. That understanding changed something inside them. For the first time, reaching out no longer felt impossible. It simply felt human. They accepted that they could never control the outcome of an honest conversation, but they could control whether they continued hiding behind assumptions. They no longer wanted their story to be shaped by questions beginning with, "What if?" They wanted whatever happened next to be built on truth instead of imagination. Before the night ended, they opened their phone once more. Their hands hesitated for a moment, not because their feelings had changed, but because they understood the importance of what they were considering. They looked at your name for a long time without pressing a single button. In that quiet moment they smiled softly because they realized something that would have been impossible for them to admit only a few days earlier. Just seeing your name no longer filled them with fear. It filled them with gratitude. Gratitude for having met someone whose presence had taught them that genuine connection still exists. Gratitude for discovering that the strongest emotions are often the quietest ones. Gratitude for understanding that real affection is not measured by constant communication but by the way someone continues to occupy your heart even during long periods of silence. As they placed the phone back down, they made a promise to themselves that nobody else could hear. They promised they would no longer allow fear to write the ending of a story that honesty deserved the chance to finish. Whether tomorrow, next week, or sometime later, they knew one thing with complete certainty. If life offered another opportunity to speak with you, they would not waste it hiding behind the same walls that had kept them silent for so long. Because after everything that had unfolded over the past few days, one truth had become impossible to ignore. Some people cross our path and quietly change the direction of our heart forever, and once that truth is finally accepted, every step forward becomes less about escaping the past and more about finding the courage to create a future that no longer leaves the most important words unsaid. The days continued to pass, yet something inside them refused to return to the way it had been before. Every morning they woke with the quiet hope that the questions inside their heart would somehow become smaller, but instead those questions became clearer. It was no longer about wondering whether you had crossed their mind. That answer had already revealed itself. You had become part of their everyday thoughts without them even trying. The real question now was why they had spent so much time believing they had to hide it. They began noticing how often fear had influenced the biggest decisions of their life. Not just with you, but with so many things they once cared deeply about. They realized that every time life offered them something meaningful, their first instinct had always been to protect themselves rather than trust what they felt. Looking back, they could finally see the pattern. They had mistaken emotional safety for emotional peace, never understanding that the two were completely different. Safety had kept them from getting hurt, but it had also kept them from saying the words their heart carried for so long. Peace, they were beginning to understand, only comes when a person is honest with themselves. That lesson stayed with them throughout the day. While everyone around them continued living ordinary lives, they quietly carried a decision that was slowly becoming impossible to ignore. They no longer wanted another week to pass wondering what might have happened if they had simply spoken honestly. They no longer wanted to replay old conversations searching for hidden meanings or missed opportunities. They wanted something real. Even if that reality came with uncertainty, it felt better than remaining trapped inside endless imagination. Throughout the afternoon they found themselves smiling at memories they had once avoided because they believed remembering would only make moving on more difficult. Now those same memories brought comfort instead of pain. They remembered the way you naturally listened without making them feel judged. They remembered how easy it had been to laugh around you without pretending to be someone else. They remembered how, for reasons they could never explain, time always seemed to slow down whenever the two of you shared the same space. Those moments had never been extraordinary to anyone watching from the outside, yet inside their heart they had quietly become unforgettable. That realization surprised them because they finally understood that the strongest connections are rarely built during dramatic moments. They grow quietly through small acts of understanding, kindness, patience, and genuine attention. Those simple memories had stayed alive because they carried something deeper than excitement. They carried peace. As evening approached, they found themselves wondering what your life looked like at that exact moment. Were you also busy with ordinary responsibilities while quietly carrying emotions nobody else could see? Had life changed you in the same ways it had changed them? Did certain songs still remind you of old conversations? Did familiar places ever bring back unexpected memories? They knew they could not answer any of those questions, yet they could not stop asking them. For the first time, however, those questions were no longer filled with fear. Instead, they were filled with curiosity and hope. They realized hope is not believing everything will happen exactly the way we imagine. Hope is simply believing that honesty is always worth more than silence. That understanding gave them a quiet confidence they had never felt before. Later that evening, while sitting alone once again, they opened an old notebook where random thoughts had been written over many months. As they turned the pages, they noticed something that made them pause. Several entries mentioned feeling that something important was missing from their life, yet none of those entries explained what that missing piece actually was. Reading those words now, the answer felt obvious. They had never been missing success, money, or recognition. They had been missing the courage to acknowledge the connection that continued living inside their heart. It almost made them laugh at themselves because sometimes the truth stays in front of us for so long that we stop recognizing it. They closed the notebook slowly and sat in complete silence. There was no dramatic revelation. No sudden miracle. Just one quiet moment of complete honesty. They finally admitted that the person they kept trying to forget was also the person who had taught them the most about themselves. That thought changed the way they viewed everything that had happened between you. Instead of seeing distance as failure, they began seeing it as time that had prepared them to become more honest than they had ever been before. Every difficult day had taught them patience. Every lonely evening had taught them gratitude for genuine connection. Every unanswered question had slowly led them toward the courage they were now beginning to feel. As darkness settled outside, they reached for their phone once more. This time they did not open it because of impulse. They opened it because they no longer wanted fear to be the loudest voice inside their mind. They looked at your name again, and instead of feeling anxious, they felt something beautifully simple. They felt thankful that life had introduced them to someone who still occupied their thoughts with kindness rather than bitterness. They realized that regardless of what happened next, meeting you had changed the way they understood love itself. Love was no longer something they associated with perfection or certainty. It had become something much quieter. It was remembering someone during ordinary moments without trying. It was wishing them happiness even during long periods of silence. It was recognizing that some people continue inspiring growth simply because of the way they once treated us. That understanding brought an unexpected calmness over them. For the first time in a very long while, they stopped worrying about whether the timing had been perfect. Instead, they focused on becoming the kind of person who would never again allow fear to silence what mattered most. They knew the future could not be predicted, but they also knew that living with honesty would always bring more peace than living with endless regret. And somewhere deep inside, beyond every doubt they had carried for so long, one quiet promise continued growing stronger. If life created even the smallest opportunity for your paths to cross again, they would no longer stand behind the walls they had built around their heart. They would meet that moment with sincerity, because after everything they had experienced, they finally understood that the greatest conversations in life do not begin with perfect words. They begin with one brave decision to stop hiding the truth that has been waiting patiently inside the heart all along.